No Other Life presents Upstaged. Coming to terms. This is an episode that, in a way, kind of wags the dog, and I usually don't do that, but I wanted to do an episode about realizing what is going on in your life. And I kind of backfilled it because I have a track in my library called Realized. And all of these one word titles that I have are deliberately thought out. I always have a working title, something that just lets me remember which file to open up and keep working on. And as I've said before, some of these are very rudimentary, the date maybe, or an adjective. And then eventually they become something else. Either I hone that word or I change paths and I say, that one called treehouse actually feels more to me like a dolphin. And I haven't written either of those works yet, so please don't steal those ideas. But in this particular case, as with many, the final term that I use for that one word title will be one that has dual meaning. And for the album, which was called No Other Life, now called No Other Life EP, in order to distinguish it from the greater project and also the podcast, all of which bear the name No Other Life, I was going through something difficult. I've talked about this before. The repercussions of which I had not realized at the point I was writing all these, how long into the future they would continue to bother me, how long I would continue to be concerned about the people around me whom I hold dear. All of these things were very much in play at this point in time. And it worked two ways to use this title, Realized. And the way that you might think of first would be that you realize something. It comes into your mind, you make note of it, I'll say. But then there's that other kind of prophetic use of the word realize, realization, in which everything that comes to pass is eventually realized. So it's as if something was a foregone conclusion, a self-fulfilling prophecy, many phrases in the world that can apply here, but you knew something was going to happen, and then it happens. And in this particular case, that was the dual intention of that piece. And to be honest, this 4-movement EP, I haven't listened to it in a few months. And I often, to be totally frank, remember more the feeling of a particular piece like this than I do the actual notes. I couldn't perform anything that I've ever written from memory. That's not the way my brain works. It was kind of funny. When I was a choral student, I could memorize in any language an entire cantata oratorio just by being in the rehearsals. When it was time to stand up in the hall with 1,000 people assembled and have to go through the laboriousness of holding the score and turning pages as if I were looking at them, it was a real nuisance. And I always envied the choirs that you see performing with no score for any person. And that always seemed really appealing to me because I didn't want to be holding it. But if I contrast that to my piano playing, I never can remember anything about what notes come next. I couldn't write something that I've seen a million times. There's not a photographic memory for that. I can remember the chords often and find my way just by having a pretty good ear, but I couldn't tell you what this piece was going to sound like when I clicked on it today to say, I wonder if that would be a good one to talk about with this concept. And it immediately took me back to all the feelings that I was having at the time of its creation, understandably, as everything that I write is very passion filled and for good reasons. I don't do anything by mistake. I might come up with a theme by mistake or happenstance, but I don't just fart around. Yeah. So in this particular case, it really all came back to me. And that was meaningful. And I'll talk more about that when it's a little less raw or something that feels like it needs to come to the fore. But for the time being, it doesn't. Life was hard. It's getting better. But right now, I was thinking about the realization of what is going on in your own life. And I've said before that when Parkinson's came into our family, I was ready to welcome it. And the reason for that was largely due to the fact that it came at the conclusion, as the denouement to a 10 or 8 year path of going through the jungle, just no idea what was wrong. I had symptoms by the plenty. And if each one of them represented something else, I felt like a very sick person. But with the announcement of Parkinson's and the word with capitalized P and D, I can wrap my head around that. I don't necessarily want to, but I can. And all of those symptoms were no longer, 100 problems. They were one problem. And maybe some of this medicine, some of that exercise, some of that nutrition, some of that sleep, all of those things will work together to try to slow down the inevitable progression in the downward way. And I was comfortable with that. But I know that a lot of people are not. And I have people in my own life who seem to know that they have something on the horizon, but they don't want to know. Or they don't want to then have to commit to the amount of effort it takes to still live a pretty good life. And that wasn't me. I'm trying as hard as I can to improve my life, not even to maintain it. But I could just as well see saying, I have good memories. I'm going to just see where this goes. That just wasn't the way that I wanted to go. And it had a lot to do with the things going on in my world and the people in my life and the place where I was in my own life, progression, things that I still wanted to do. It had to do with the age that I was and where I was in my career. All of these things absolutely factored in. And so I would never consider judging someone for their decision to pursue it vigorously, to roll over, or to say, I'm going to see what happens, or anything in between. Because some people take the medicine and do the best they can with just that. Some people don't want any medicine, but they will vigorously pursue the exercise route, which is also shown to do a great job at slowing degeneration in ways that the medicine can't even seem to do. And there are people in all other walks as well. And I'm not just talking about my disease. If you think about any disease, there are people who have received news and take it in a certain way, or they don't want to receive the news, or they aren't resourced enough to be able to even find out the news. There's so many different parts of this. And so when I think about this term realized, when I think about what it means to realize what is going on in your life, it's harrowing. It really is. And even though I may sound optimistic, even though I'm always saying that I'm working with Parkinson's, not trying to fight it, all these different things, they're really just head games. Because any one of us wants to live the best we can, and any one of us might have ideas of how we're going to successfully achieve that. So, what do? You wake up, you do your best, and hopefully you have established a path where you're at least doing what you mean to be doing. You know, the most dangerous thing we can do is come to complacency, where we have reached a milestone, we've reached a goal, or perhaps we've reached some sort of a denouement, as I said of it, where we've been trying to get an answer, and then you get to that answer, but you don't know the next step. You haven't thought that far, or you're afraid maybe to come to terms with it. When you reach those complacent junctions in your life, that's where you start to get into a lot of frustration, a lot of trouble, a lot of anguish. And so I've talked about recently this year in various places this hope for you to not fall into complacency. When you're reaching the end of something and you've been working hard at it, keep in mind what will come next. When something befalls you that you weren't expecting, you can do whatever you need to live with that, to come to terms with it. But then you need to say, okay, what's next? Because there always is the opportunity for a next. And I've even mentioned with respect to Parkinson's, which is a nefarious little monster, that there are things that are in my life right now that weren't 6 years ago when I got diagnosed, that weren't in my life 15 years ago when I started thinking, something's not quite right here. And eventually, I'll have even more things going on in my life. And eventually, I'll be at a point where PD in some form or other has been with me half my life. And then eventually, it will have been with me more than half my life, and so on. So it does me no good. It would do me no good to say, I don't want to face it. Because I want to live the life that explores all that there is to be explored. And I have to do it with different resources. I get that. I'm not thrilled about it, but I get it. And I know that only by facing it head on, only by realizing, as an earlier subtitle of this podcast suggested, that Parkinson's is a director, an overbearing impresario, a difficult drill instructor, all of these things. And you need to realize who is in control. Because if you're able to work with that troubled monster, you'll be a lot better off than if you just fight it every day and complain about him and say, why are you hurting me so much? The reason that it's hurting you so much is because you have a disease, and it sucks. It really does. But you don't hate yourself. And Parkinson's is now a part of myself and perhaps yourself if you are also living with this. But whatever it is that you're living with, you need to determine, is it with me for the duration? And if so, do I want to coexist and live affably with it as best I can? Or is it something that truly needs to be fought, something that needs to be battled with, that needs to be removed? If it's the latter, then fight. Do everything you can. Think about it in those terms. Fight with all you have in you to eradicate this from your life, from your body. There are some things that with present science can't be fought with, can't be eradicated. And the best we can do today in the current year, in the current world, is coexist, share the stage, try to do our best to keep living our lives around the fact that there's this tenant in our body, this border that we don't want to be boarding in our body. But we're going to do our best to keep trucking on and live with it the best we can. And so it is with that sentiment that I bring to you the track from my EP, No Other Life, called Realized. If you'd never heard that piece and you want to hear a little bit more of it, it is featured on that EP called No Other Life. You know the title, it's easy to find. Go to rickseahome.com or my Bandcamp. If you go to my own site, you're going to see the latest news, archived social media, posts for all the podcasts. Upstaged and No Other Life are both independently conceived of and managed by just little old me, Rick Seahome, ad-free and without interruption for all listeners. I appreciate all your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and spread the word. That's the number one way to keep it going. Friends, you have no other life, and it's the grandest improv session of them all. Own what you bring to this scene and share it with all whom you meet.